Evening, friend. Pull up close and let the warmth settle into your bones, for the night is long and there's no hurry in it. I've got a story for you tonight about a hard old man who was not, it turned out, hard at all, and the daughter who learned the truth of him 3 weeks too late to tell him she finally understood. It's a gentle story in the end, though it starts in a graveyard. Most of the best ones do. Pour yourself something warm. Let your shoulders come down. And let me tell you about Silas Roan, the most feared bounty hunter in the territory, and the locked leather book he left behind. Let your breathing slow. Let your eyes grow heavy when they're ready. There's nothing here tonight but the fire, and the story, and the long quiet turning of the dark toward morning. 3 weeks after they buried Silas Roan, his daughter Della finally found the courage to open the old leather ledger he had kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk for 30 years. She had expected a tally of the men he had hunted, for her father had been the hardest, most feared bounty hunter in the territory, a man who brought in the worst of the worst and showed them no mercy, or so the whole country believed, and the names were there, hundreds of them, written in his careful hand down 30 years of pages. But beside most of those names, Della found something she could not understand. A small mark, a date, a few quiet words, and slowly, page by page, in the lamplight of her dead father's study, she began to realize that the man the whole territory had feared was not at all the man she was reading about. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. Now, settle in. Let me tell you about the man they put in the ground. They came from 3 counties to see Silas Roan put in the ground. It was a gray morning in the early spring, with a cold wind coming down off the hills, and the new grass not yet up. And the little cemetery on the edge of the town of Halloran was more crowded than it had been in years. Folks stood in their dark clothes among the leaning headstones, and they watched the plain pine box lowered into the cold ground. And they did not weep, most of them, for they had not come to mourn. They had come, if the truth be told, to be certain, to stand at the graveside and see with their own eyes that Silas Roan was truly in it, and the lid truly closed, and the earth truly going down on top of him. For 30 years the man had been a shadow over the whole territory, and a great many people wanted to be sure the shadow was finally gone. He had been a bounty hunter. The bounty hunter, folks said, the hardest and most feared in all that country. For 30 years, if a man did something bad enough to get his name on a poster and a price on his head, it was Silas Roan he came to fear above all others. For Roan, they said, always brought his man in. He could not be bought. He could not be bargained with. He could not be thrown off a trail once he had taken it, nor frightened off, nor reasoned with. He rode alone, spoke little, and went where the worst men in the territory went, and brought them back one after another, year after year, for 30 long years. The stories told of him were the kind that grow in the telling, that he never slept, that he never missed, that he had a heart like a stone and eyes like a winter sky. Mothers in that country hushed their children with his name. Hard men went pale at the rumor that Silas Roan had taken an interest in them. And the strange thing, the thing nobody at that graveside would have believed if you had told them, the thing Della herself did not yet know, was that very nearly every word of it was true, and every word of it was wrong. He had done all those things. He had ridden alone and spoken little, and gone where the worst men went, and never been bought or turned. The territory had the facts of him exactly right. It was only the meaning of the facts they had gotten backwards, every one of them, for 30 years. But that is getting ahead of the story, and there is no hurry, friend. Let the man be buried first the way the territory buried him, as the hardest man it ever knew. And he had a daughter. Her name was Della, and she stood now a little apart from the crowd at the graveside, a young woman of perhaps 25 in a plain dark dress, watching them bury the father she had never really known. For that was the strange and sorrowful truth of Della Roan's life, that she had been the daughter of the most talked about man in the territory, and had hardly known him at all. Her mother had died when Della was small, and her father, even then, had been gone more than he was home, away on the long trails after this man or that, sending money back faithfully, but rarely coming himself. Della had been raised mostly by an aunt, and then, when the aunt passed, by her own resourceful self, in the house her father kept in Halloran, but seldom slept in. He had loved her. She believed that in a dim and unproven way, but he had loved her from a great distance, in silences and absences, and the careful, regular sending of money. And never once in all her life had he sat her down and let her see whatever it was that lived behind those winter eyes. So she did not weep at his grave either, though for a different reason than the rest of them. She did not weep because she did not know what she felt. How do you mourn a stranger who was also your father? How do you grieve a man you never had, and now never will? She stood in the cold spring wind and watched the earth go down on the pine box, and she felt mostly a kind of vast and weary confusion, the confusion of a daughter left at the end with nothing but questions, and a man she could no longer ask, she thought. Standing there, of the few memories she did have of him, and how thin they were, how few, for a whole father across a whole childhood. She remembered the sound of his horse in the yard late at night, the rare welcome sound of his coming home, and how she would lie awake and listen and not quite dare to hope it was him. She remembered his hands, which were large and scarred, and surprisingly gentle on the few occasions they had rested on her hair. She remembered him sitting at the supper table on his short visits, quiet, watchful, a little awkward, as though he had forgotten how to be in a house, how to be a father, and was trying his best to remember. She remembered most of all the way he would look at her sometimes, when he thought she did not see. A long, sad, searching look, full of something she could never name, that would vanish the instant she turned her eyes to his. She had spent her whole childhood trying to decode that look. She had never managed it, and now she thought she never would. When it was done, The folks of the 3 counties went home satisfied that the shadow was gone, and Della Roan walked back alone through the cold to the empty house her father had left her. The house and the horse, and whatever else a hard and solitary man leaves behind. She did not yet know about the ledger. That would come later, when she had gathered the courage to go through his things. But it was waiting for her, locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, 30 years thick, ready to tell her everything the man himself never had. It took Della 3 weeks to bring herself to go through her father's study. It was the one room in the house that had been truly his, the room he retreated to on the rare nights he was home, the door he closed behind him. As a girl, she had not been allowed in it. As a woman, she had simply never had reason to enter, for her father was hardly ever there to be visited. Now it was hers like everything else, and yet she found she could not make herself open the door. Not for 3 weeks. It felt like trespass. It felt like waking him. So she let it sit, and she tended to the easier business of a death, the small, endless tasks, until at last, on a quiet evening with the spring rain soft on the windows, she lit a lamp and went in. It was a plain room, a worn chair, a cold stove, a shelf of well-read books, a desk. There was less of the man in it than she had expected. And somehow that was the saddest thing, that even his private room gave so little of him away. She stood in the doorway a moment, lamp in hand, and looked at it, and felt the particular ache of a child who has lost the chance to know a parent. This was where he had sat the few nights he was home. This was the chair he had warmed, the books he had read, the window he had looked out of into the dark. And she had never once been in here with him. She had never sat at his knee in this room and asked him about his day, the way other children did with their fathers, because he was never home, and because the door was always closed, and because by the time she was old enough to think of asking, she had already learned that her father was a locked room she would never be let into. Well, he was gone now, and the room was hers, and she would go into it at last, though years too late for it to do either of them any good. She went through the desks slowly, drawer by drawer. Old correspondence, mostly business, the dry leavings of his trade, letters from sheriffs and marshals, notices, receipts, nothing personal, nothing that spoke. She found a few small things that pierced her. A lock of her mother's hair, folded in paper, a tiny faded photograph of herself as a baby, worn soft as though it had been carried a long way and looked at often. A child's drawing she dimly remembered making of a horse that she had not known he had kept. So he had carried her with him, in his way, all those years on the trail. The discovery brought tears to her eyes and made the distance between them in life ache all the worse. She was near to giving up, near to deciding that her father had taken whatever he truly was down into the cold ground with him when she came to the bottom drawer and found it locked. It was the only locked thing in the house, and that, of course, made her want to open it more than she had wanted anything in 3 weeks. She hunted for the key and found it at last where he had hidden it, taped beneath the top of the desk where a searching hand would find it but a careless eye would not. And she understood, finding it there, that he had meant for it to be found. He had not thrown the key away. He had hidden it where his daughter, going carefully through his things, would come upon it. Whatever was in that drawer, Silas Roan had wanted her, some day, to see it. The thought made her hands unsteady as she fitted the little key to the lock. It was, she would understand only much later, the one message her father had managed to leave her. The one thing the silent man had found a way to say. He could not tell her the truth in life. It was too dangerous, and he was too closed, and the habit of 30 years' secrecy was too deep in him to break, even for his own child. But he could hide a key where she would find it after he was gone, and trust the book to say in his stead all the things his tongue never could. It was a strange and roundabout and heart-breaking way for a father to open his heart to his daughter. But it was the only way he had, and he had taken it, had thought of her at the end, and made sure that when he was safely dead and could no longer be harmed by the knowing, she would finally be led into the locked room of him at last. Inside the drawer was a single object. A ledger, a thick book bound in worn brown leather, its spine cracked with use, its pages soft and swollen with 30 years of handling. Della lifted it out and set it on the desk in the lamplight, and she sat down in her father's worn chair, and she opened it. The first pages were what she had expected, and her heart sank a little to see them, for they confirmed the stories. Names, page after page of names, written in her father's careful, cramped, particular hand. A hand she knew from 30 years of the brief notes that had come with the money. Beside each name, a date, and a sum of money, and now and then a place. It was just as she had feared, a tally of his trade, a record of 30 years of hunting men, 100 names. More, the grim accounting of the hardest man in the territory. But as she read on, turning the soft pages in the lamplight with the rain whispering at the glass, Della began to notice something. Beside most of the names, there was something more than the date and the sum. A small mark, a symbol of some kind, set down careful in the margin. And beside many of the names, in the cramped private hand, a few quiet words. And the words did not say what she expected the words of a bounty hunter to say. She bent closer to the page and read one of them, and frowned, and then she read it again. And a small, cold thread of confusion began to wind its way through Della Roan, there in her dead father's chair, that would not be untangled for a long while yet. The entry she had stopped on was the very first in the book, dated 30 years back, and it read like this. A name, Jonas Pike. A date, a bounty noted beside it. A fair sum for those days, and then, below, in her father's cramped hand, a single, quiet line. Let him go. Sent the money to the widow Pike, Cedar Crossing. Della read it 3 times. It made no sense to her at all. Her father had been a bounty hunter, the bounty hunter, the man who always brought them in. Bounty hunters did not let men go. That was the whole of the trade. That was the thing the territory feared, and the thing the money was paid for. And no bounty hunter on God's earth let a man go and then sent the reward money. Money he had not even collected. Money he had given up by letting a man go to anyone's widow. It was nonsense. It was backwards. It was the opposite of everything she had ever been told about Silas Roan. She turned the page The next entry a few weeks later. Another name, another bounty, and beside it, one of the small, careful marks and a line in the cramped hand. Brought in, bad one. No help for it. So that one he had brought in, that fit the stories. But the words beside it, no help for it, were the words of a man who took no pleasure in it, who did the thing because it had to be done and not because his heart was stone. Della turned more pages faster now, the confusion in her growing. And slowly, entry by entry, the pattern of the marks came clear to her. And as it came clear, the whole world she had believed in began quietly to turn over. There were two main marks she came to see. One she found beside the names of men her father had truly brought in. The genuinely dangerous, the murderers and the worst of the worst, the men there was, as he wrote again and again, no help for. Those he had hunted and caught and delivered, hard and sure, just as the legend said. But that mark, the bringing in mark, was on fewer than half the names in the book. Fewer than half. It was a small thing, that mark, a simple short stroke, like a closed door. And the more of them Della found, the more she came to understand the weight her father had carried in making it. For beside those names, too, there were sometimes lines, and the lines were never triumphant, never proud, never the words of a man pleased with his catch. They were heavy words, no help for it. A bad one saw the graves myself, brought him in. God forgive me if I judged wrong. That last line stopped her cold. God forgive me if I judged wrong. Her father, the hard man, the cold man, agonizing in the privacy of this locked book over whether he had judged each man rightly, carrying the terrible weight of having set himself up as the one who decided. The bringing in mark was not the mark of a stone heart. It was the mark of a man who felt every single one and brought them in anyway, because some men truly must be brought in, and someone must bear the weight of doing it. The other mark, the one that appeared beside name after name after name down 30 years of pages, meant something else entirely. It meant he had let the man go. And besides those names, again and again in his cramped and private hand were the quiet lines that told Della what her father had truly done with his 30 years. Let him go. Young fool, scared, stole to feed his family, sent the money to them, told him to go straight north and not come back. Let him go. The poster lied. He never did the thing helped him get clear of the territory. Let him go. Sick man dying anyway, let him die at home with his people. Sent the body to the doctor for the others. Let him go. A boy, just a boy, took him to the mission and paid his keep. On and on, page after page, 30 years of it. The most feared bounty hunter in the territory, the hard man, the cold man, the man who always brought them in, had spent the better part of his life quietly letting men go, hunting them down with all his terrible skill, yes, finding them when no one else could, but then, when he had them, when their lives were in his hands, looking at each one and judging, and in case after case after case, deciding that this man did not deserve the rope or the cell that waited at the end of the trail, and quietly turning him loose and giving up the bounty. and more often than not sending money of his own to the family the man had wronged or the family the man had left behind. Della sat back in the chair, the rain whispering at the glass, the lamp burning low, and she stared at the open book, and she did not know the man whose hand had written it at all, or rather, and this was the thing that turned slowly in her all that long night, she had never known him. And now, suddenly, page by page, she was meeting him for the first time. Every entry was an introduction. "Here's your father," the page said. "Here is what he did with the hour you never saw, the trail you were never on, the life he lived in all those absences you grieved. The cold, distant man who had sent money and stayed away was dissolving before her eyes. And in his place, a different man was assembling himself out of the careful, cramped lines, a man of such patient, secret, stubborn goodness that Della could hardly hold the size of it. She kept having to stop, to set the book down, to press her hands to her face, to walk to the cold window and look out at the dark, and then come back and read more, because each entry was small, but the sum of them was enormous, and the sum of them was her father. And she had buried him 3 weeks ago, believing he was someone else entirely. She turned the page. She read all that night. She could not have stopped if she had wanted to, and she did not want to. The lamp burned down, and she trimmed it and read on, and the rain stopped, and the house grew cold around her, and still she turned the soft pages of her father's ledger, name by name, year by year, learning him backwards from the end of his life to the beginning. It was the longest night of her life, and in a way the most precious, for she spent it, at last, alone with her father, closer to him in that one dark lamp-lit night than she had been in all the years he was alive, though he was 3 weeks in the ground, and could never know she had finally come to find him. And the more she read, the larger the secret grew, until it filled the whole study, the whole house, the whole memory of her childhood. She read of a man let go because the poster had named the wrong brother. She read of a man let go because the thing he'd stolen to bury his wife. She read of a man let go because he was 16 years old and had fallen in with bad company and still had, in her father's judgment, a whole life in which to come right. She read of money sent and sent and sent, to this widow and that orphan, to a church, to a school, to a town that had been robbed by a man her father then declined to punish, so that the town lost nothing and the man kept his life. Each entry was only a line or two, dry and brief in her father's cramped hand, and yet behind each one Della could see, now that she knew how to look, an entire act of quiet mercy, a whole human life, pulled back from the edge of ruin by a hard-faced stranger who then rode away and never spoke of it. 100 names he had let go, more than 100. She counted them finally near dawn, going back through carefully, and the men Silas Roan had quietly turned loose over 30 years numbered more than the men he had brought in, by a good margin. The hardest bounty hunter in the territory had, it turned out, been the softest. He had used his terrible reputation, the fear, the legend, the stories that made hard men go pale. He had used all of it as a kind of cover, because a man feared as Silas Roan was feared could go where he liked and take whom he liked, and no one ever questioned him. No one ever followed up to see whether the man he had gone after had truly been delivered to the law, or whether he had instead been quietly let go on some lonesome stretch of trail with a few dollars and a stern word and a second chance. The legend of the merciless hunter was the perfect disguise for a merciful one. No one suspects the hardest man in the territory of being kind. And Della saw, as the long night wore on, why it had to be so. A soft-hearted bounty hunter, a man known to let the desperate go, would not have lasted a season. The hard men would have run rings around him. The law would have stopped trusting him. The families of the truly wicked would have hounded him. But a man feared as Silas Roan was feared was untouchable. The legend was armor. The legend was a key that opened every door in the territory. Sheriffs handed him their hardest cases without question. Hard men surrendered to him without a fight, certain that resistance was useless. And because everyone was so sure they knew exactly what Silas Roan was, the merciless deliverer, the man who always brought them in, no one ever thought to check. No one ever followed. No one ever discovered that half the men he rode out after simply vanished from the records, let go on some lonesome trail to start again. He had built the most fearsome reputation in the territory not out of pride, not out of cruelty, but because it was the strongest possible shield behind which to be secretly, relentlessly, 30 years faithfully kind. It was, Della thought, the most extraordinary thing she had ever heard of. Her father had spent his whole life pretending to be the opposite of what he was, and had done it so well that he had fooled an entire territory, and his own daughter, and very nearly the grave, and the money. That was the part that undid her most. Della had grown up believing her father a wealthy man. He had sent money faithfully all her life, and the territory assumed he had grown rich on 30 years of bounties. But the ledger told another story. Time and again he had given up the bounty entirely, letting his man go and collecting nothing. And time and again, on top of that, he had sent money of his own to the widow of a man he'd let live, to the children of a man he'd judged more desperate than wicked, to a mission for a boy, to a doctor for a town. The careful, regular sums that had come to Della all her life had been only a part of a great, quiet outflowing of money, going out in all directions across the territory for 30 years, to people who never knew where it came from, sent by a man who took care that they never should. He had not been rich at all. She had given nearly all of it away. The hard, cold legend that the 3 counties had come to bury, satisfied to see the shadow gone. That man had spent 30 years and very nearly every dollar he ever earned, quietly mending the broken lives the law would only have broken further. Della Roan closed the ledger as the gray light came up at the window, and she sat a long while in the cold, holding it in her lap with both hands, the way you hold something precious. She had come into that room 3 weeks after the funeral, hoping only to understand at last the stranger who had been her father. And she had found him, but finding him had only opened a far deeper question, the question that would, in the days to come, send her out across the territory on a journey of her own. For now, She knew what her father had done, but she did not yet know why. What had made a man become such a thing, feared by all, understood by none, pouring out mercy in secret for 30 years and never once telling a living soul, not even his own daughter? There was a reason. There had to be a reason, and Della meant to find it. Now, if you're still awake and this fire is keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming, one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were. A daughter has learned what her father did. Now she's going to go and find out why. And the answer is waiting at the very back of the book where the very first story began. The answer, when Della found it, was not in the ledger at all, or rather, it was behind the ledger, tucked into a slit in the leather of the back cover, a folded paper so old and soft it had nearly become part of the binding. She found it on the second night, going back through the book more slowly, and she drew it out with careful fingers and unfolded it in the lamplight. And she read the story of how Silas Roan became the man he became. It was written in his hand, but a younger hand, the letters less cramped, set down long ago. It was not a long account. Her father had never been a man of many words, on the page or off it, but it was enough. When Silas Roan was a young man, younger than Della was now, he had done a bad thing. The paper did not dwell on what. It said only that he had been desperate and foolish, and had taken what was not his, and that a man had been hurt in the doing of it, though not killed. And there had been a price put on young Silas Roan's head, and a bounty hunter had come after him. The hunter had caught him too, out on a lonesome stretch of country with nowhere left to run. Silas had been certain he was going to hang. He was a young man with a young man's whole life still before him, and he had thrown it away in one stupid, desperate hour. And now a hard old bounty hunter had him at the end of a gun, and the rope was as good as around his neck already. He had begged, the paper said, Silas Roan, who would become the most feared man in the territory, had wept and begged for his life on that lonesome trail. A frightened boy who had made one terrible mistake. He had not been proud of the begging, but he set it down years later in the honest account at the back of the book, because it was the truth, and because it was the begging, perhaps, that had saved him. For the old hunter had seen in the weeping boy not a criminal, but a child who had gone wrong and knew it, and was not yet lost. But the old hunter had not brought him in. He had looked at the shaking young man a long while, the paper said, and asked him quiet questions. Who he was, where he was from, why he had done the thing, what he had meant to do with the rest of his life before he threw it away. And he had listened to the answers, really listened the way no one had listened to Silas Roan in a long time. And then he had done the thing that made no sense, the thing that bounty hunters did not do. He had let Silas Roan go. He had given him a little money and pointed him north and told him to make something better of the life he'd been about to lose. And then the old hunter had said a thing that young Silas never forgot, the thing that became, in time, the whole secret engine of his life. He had said, I've brought in men who deserved it, and I've let go men who didn't, and I've learned the second kind matters more. Someday you'll be in a position to judge a man yourself. When you are, judge him the way you'd want to be judged right now. And then the old hunter had ridden away, and young Silas Roan had gone north and had made something better of his life, just as he'd been told. He had gone straight. He had married and had a daughter, and when, in time, he cast about for a trade that would let him do the thing the old hunter had set in him, he became, of all things, a bounty hunter himself, because he had understood the old man's secret. A bounty hunter, feared enough, trusted enough, left alone enough, was the one man in all the territory who could stand at the crossroads of the law and mercy and choose, could find the desperate and the wrongly accused and the merely foolish before the law's blunt machinery ground them up, and judge them as he himself had once been judged, and turn them loose toward something better. He had spent 30 years passing on the gift the old hunter gave him, 100 times over and more, and he had never told anyone, because the old hunter had never told anyone either. And Silas had understood that the secrecy was part of the gift, that mercy done for show is half spoiled, and mercy done in the dark is whole. Della read the old folded paper twice, there in the lamplight, and then she pressed it to her chest and bowed her head. And at last, 3 weeks and 2 days after they buried him, she wept for her father, not the stranger she had buried, but the man she had finally met. She wept for a long time there in his worn chair, in his quiet room with his book open before her and his life laid bare at last. She wept for the boy he had been, weeping on a lonesome trail with a rope as good as round his neck, given his life back by a stranger's mercy. She wept for the man he had become, riding 30 years of hard country alone, the best heart in the territory hidden behind the coldest face, doing good and taking blame, feared by all and known by none. She wept for the father who had loved her from a distance he could not close, who had kept her baby picture soft with handling, who had given her that long, sad, searching look across the room and never been able to tell her why. And she wept a little for herself, for the years of believing him hard, for the funeral she had stood through dry-eyed and confused, for all the questions she could have asked him and now never could. But beneath the grief, rising slowly through it as she sat there in the lamplight, was something else, something she had not felt in connection with her father in all her life. A deep, warm, steadying pride. He had been, it turned out, a great man, a secretly, stubbornly, magnificently good man, and she was his daughter. That was hers to keep now, forever, no matter what else had been lost. She could have stopped there. She had her answer. She understood him now as fully as the dead can be understood. But Della Roan was her father's daughter, more than she had ever known, and she found she could not simply close the book and let it be. She wanted to see it. She wanted to stand in the places where the quiet work had been done and look in the faces of the people it had been done for, and know that the secret in the ledger was real and not just words on a page. And there was something more, something she only half admitted to herself. She had missed knowing her father in life. She could not have that back. but she could, perhaps, come to know him now, in death, by walking the country he had walked and meeting the people whose lives he had touched, could gather him up, piece by piece, from all the places he had scattered himself, and so have, at the last, the father she had never been given. It was a strange way to come to know a man, by riding the roads of his secret kindness after he was gone. But it was the only way left to her, and she took it. And so, in the soft, full spring, she saddled her father's horse and tucked the ledger into her saddlebag and rode out across the territory to follow the thread of his mercy back through 30 years. It felt, those first days on the road, like the most natural thing in the world, and she understood with a small, sad smile that this too was an inheritance, that she had her father's restlessness in her, his ease in the saddle, his willingness to ride a long way alone towards something that mattered. She had spent her life thinking she was nothing like the distant, hard man who had fathered her. She was, she began to see, very much his daughter indeed. She went first to Cedar Crossing, to the very first entry. Jonas Pike, and the widow to whom her father had sent the money. It was a long ride, and Cedar Crossing turned out to be a small dying place, half its buildings empty. But the widow Pike was still there. She was very old now, a tiny bent woman in a clean, poor house at the edge of town. And when Della told her gently who she was, the daughter of Silas Roan, the old woman's face went strange and soft. She had never known the name, the old woman said. 30 years ago, her husband Jonas had run off after some foolishness, and a poster had gone up, and she had given him up for hanged or killed, left alone with 2 small children, and not $1 to her name. And then a stranger's money had begun to come, a little, regular, for years, enough to keep the children fed, enough to keep the roof on, sent by no name she ever knew, from no place she could ever trace. She had thought it an angel. She had told her children it was an angel. And Jonas had come home after a year, changed and quiet and grateful to be alive, and never spoke of where he'd been or how he'd got free, and had been a good husband and a good father all the rest of his days, dead now these 10 years, in his own bed, an old forgiven man. That money kept my babies alive, the old woman said, holding Della's hands in her 2 tiny ones. And something let my Jonas come home. I never knew who. All these years I never knew who. And she looked at Della with her old wet eyes and said, "Your father. It was your father. Both of those things. Your father." They sat together a long while in the poor, clean little house, the bounty hunter's daughter and the woman his first mercy had saved. And the old woman told Della everything she could remember. What Jonas had been like as a young man, how the children had grown, how she had lit a candle every Christmas for 30 years for the nameless soul who had kept them alive. She made Della tea, and would not let her go until she had eaten. And when at last Della rose to leave, the old woman held her face in her tiny hands and looked at her a long moment and said, "You have his eyes. I never saw him, but I know it. You have your father's eyes," which was a strange thing to say of a man she had never met. But Della understood. The old woman had been looking into the kindness of Silas Roan for 30 years, even without a face to put to it. And she knew it when she saw it again, looking back at her out of his daughter. Della rode on from Cedar Crossing with her own eyes wet, and she did not stop there. All through that spring and into the summer, she followed the ledger across the territory, from name to name, place to place, gathering up the scattered pieces of her father's secret life. She did not find them all. Many had moved on or died or could not be traced. But she found enough. She found a prosperous farmer in a green valley who had been, 30 years before, the scared young horse thief her father had let go and grub-staked and pointed north. He was a gray old man now, with grown sons and a good farm and grandchildren underfoot. And when Della told him who she was, he took her into his house and sat her at his table and told his whole family, in a voice that shook, that this woman's father was the reason they all existed, that he himself would have hanged at 19, and none of them would ever have been born but for a hard-faced bounty hunter who had caught him dead to rights, and then, instead of the rope, had given him a horse and $40 and a second chance, and made him swear to use it. "I never knew his name," the old farmer said, gripping Della's hand. 30 years I've prayed for a man whose name I never knew, and here's his daughter at my table." His grandchildren stared at her as though she was something from a storybook. She found a country doctor who, as a boy, had been taken to a mission and his keep paid by a hard-faced stranger who never gave a name, an orphan headed for nothing good, sad instead on the road that made him a healer of 100 sick poor folk who could never have afforded a doctor otherwise. So her father's one mercy had become 1,000 mercies, flowing on down the years through the life he'd saved. She found, again and again, ordinary good lives. Farmers and mothers and tradesmen and grandfathers, that existed only because, somewhere on a lonesome trail, long ago, Silas Roan had looked at a frightened man and chosen to judge him kindly. And in every house she was received like the daughter of an angel. For that was what most of them had decided long ago their nameless benefactor must have been. None of them had ever guessed the truth, that their angel was the most feared man in the territory, the hard, cold bounty hunter whose name had been used to frighten children. The thought made Della want to laugh and weep at once. He had hidden it so well. He had hidden it from everyone. It was an Old Marshal in the end who told Della the last of it, the part not even the ledger held. She found him in a town far to the south, a retired lawman near 90, who had known her father across all 30 of those years, the only living soul, it turned out, who had ever come close to guessing Silas Roan's secret. He was blind now, mostly, and slow, but his mind was clear, and when Della found him on the porch of his daughter's house and told him whose girl she was, the old man reached out and took her hand and held it a long time without speaking, and she saw the tears stand in his sightless eyes. They sat together on his porch in the long summer evening, and Della told him what she had found in the book, and the old marshal nodded slowly, not surprised, his eyes far away. "I always wondered," he said. 30 years I worked alongside that man on and off, And I'll tell you a thing that never sat right with me, that I never could make add up. The men Silas Roan brought in, they were always, every one, the ones that truly needed bringing. The killers. The ones past mending. I never once saw him bring in a man you could feel sorry for. Other hunters, they brought in whoever had a price, the desperate and the foolish right along with the wicked. Didn't matter to them. A bounty's a bounty. Not Roan. Roan only ever brought in the ones that deserved it. The old man shook his head. I used to think he was just particular, just choosy about his work. It never once occurred to me. And here the old marshal's voice caught, and he had to stop a moment. It never once occurred to me that all the others, all the ones he found and didn't bring in, that he was letting them go. I thought he just hadn't caught those. Silas Roan caught everyone. I should have known. All those years right in front of me. He looked at Della. Your father, miss, was the best man I ever knew. And I knew him 30 years and never once knew it. That's how good he was at it. He hid the best heart in the territory behind the hardest face. And he fooled every one of us, and he did more good doing it than any 10 honest men I ever met. There's preachers remembered as saints for 1/10 of what that man did, quiet on the back trails, and he'll never get a word of credit for it, because to credit him would be to undo the very thing that let him do it. Even dead, he keeps the secret, even now. They sat a while in the dusk, the old marshal and the bounty hunter's daughter, and then the old man said, "One thing more. He talked about you, you know. Not often. He wasn't a talker. But the once or twice he did, it was always you. He'd say, 'I've got a girl back in Halloran,' proud like. I think he stayed away as much as he did because of the work. Because a man can't do what he did and have a family close. It's too dangerous. Too much to explain. I think keeping his distance from you was the price of it. The hardest thing he gave up of all the things he gave up." The old marshal looked out at the gathering dark. He'd be glad you know now. I expect that's why he left you the key. And Della, riding home from the old marshal's porch through the warm summer nights, turned that over and over. And slowly the last hard knot in her heart came loose. For there had been a knot there all her life beneath the confusion and the longing. A small, bitter knot of a child's old hurt. He had not been there. Whatever else was true, that remained true. She had grown up without a father, raised by an aunt, and then by herself. And no ledger full of saved strangers could quite undo the long, lonely fact of it. She had half feared, opening the book, that she would find the answer was simply that he had loved his work more than his child. But it was not that. She saw it now. It was the opposite of that. He had stayed away not because he cared too little for her, but because he could not bear to bring his terrible double life anywhere near her, could not risk the men who hated the legend of Silas Roan finding a daughter to take their hatred out on, could not explain to a child the thing he did, nor ask a child to keep so vast and dangerous a secret. His absence had not been indifference. It had been a kind of fierce protection, and a sacrifice, perhaps the largest of all the sacrifices in that book, full of sacrifices. He had given up his own daughter's childhood the way he gave up all those bounties, quietly, painfully, because he judged it the right thing and told no one, and bore the cost alone. That long, sad, searching look she had spent her childhood trying to decode. She understood it now. It was the look of a man watching across an unbridgeable distance, the one thing in all the world he loved most and could not let himself have. "Oh, Papa," she said aloud, alone, on the dark road. It was the first time she had called him that since she was a very small girl, and it was, in its way, the true funeral of Silas Roan, not the crowded graveyard of 3 counties come to make sure the shadow was gone, but a single daughter on a dark road, finally weeping for a father she had finally understood. Della Roan rode home to Halloran at the end of that long summer, a changed woman, carrying her father's ledger and her father's story. And at last, her father himself, whole and known and forgiven in her heart. She had set out 3 weeks after his funeral with nothing but questions and a stranger in a grave. She came home with a father, the truest kind of father perhaps, the kind you come to understand so deeply that he lives on in you, working through your hands. For Della had decided, somewhere on those long summer roads, what she would do with what she had found. She did not become a bounty hunter. That was her father's road, and the territory was changing, and there were other ways now. But she kept the ledger, and she kept the secret, and she found her own quiet ways to carry on the thing her father had begun. She had inherited, after all, a little money still, and a great deal of knowledge about where the broken and the desperate of that territory could be found, and a heart that had been broken open and remade by what she'd learned. And so, quietly, the way he had taught her without ever meaning to, Della Roan began to do good in the dark. A family in trouble would find help arriving from nowhere. A young fool about to throw his life away would meet at the crossroads a quiet woman who asked him hard questions and listened to the answers and pointed him north towards something better. She told no one. That was the heart of it. He had taught her that too. Mercy done in the dark is whole. It was not the same work exactly. The territory was settling, the wild years passing, and there was less call for the snatching of desperate men from the jaws of the law. But there is always need, friend, in every time and place, for the quiet kind of mercy, for someone to see the falling before they hit the ground, and to put out a hand, and to ask nothing. Della had a gift for finding such people, inherited or learned she could not say, and she had her father's whole hidden fortune of knowledge, his sense for the country and its troubles, his understanding that the worst-looking person is so often only the most frightened, his rule, written in the back of the book and burned now into her own heart. Judge a man the way you would want to be judged in your own worst hour. She lived by it. She passed it on, one quiet act at a time, to people who never knew her name, exactly as it had been passed to her father by a stranger on a lonesome trail, and to that stranger, she supposed, by someone before him. A long chain of secret mercy reaching back further than anyone could know, each link ignorant of the others, the whole of it invisible, holding the dark world up. She never married, and some in Halloran thought her a strange and solitary woman, much as they had thought her father a hard and fearful one. And she let them think it, for she had learned that what the world believes about a person is so rarely the truth of them. She lived a long, quiet life, and when at last she was old and her own time drew near, she did the thing her father had done. She took the ledger, thicker now, for she had added her own 30 years of names to his, and she put it in the bottom drawer of the desk, and she locked it, and she hid the key where a careful, loving hand would someday find it. For she had no daughter of her own, but she had a niece, a curious girl with thoughtful eyes, who reminded her more than a little of herself. And Della Roan thought that someday, 3 weeks or so after they put her in the ground, that girl might open a certain drawer and find a certain book, and learn the truth of the strange, quiet aunt she'd never really known. And perhaps, just perhaps, take up the secret and carry the mercy on. One more turning of the long, dark wheel toward the light. The fire is getting low now, and that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now, friend, soft and warm and settling toward the coals. And somewhere far off and long ago, a hard old man rides a lonesome trail with the best heart in the territory hidden behind the hardest face, doing good in the dark, asking nothing, telling no one. There's more of that in this world than we know, I think. The kindest people are so often the ones we never suspect, hiding their soft hearts behind whatever hard thing the world will let them hide it behind. And the truth of a person? Well, sometimes you only get to it at the very back of the book, in the part they never meant to show you and meant for you to find anyway. You rest easy tonight. And if there's someone in your life you've decided is hard or cold or closed, maybe wonder just for tonight what might be written in the back of their book. You might be surprised. We so often are. And if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.